So first of all, welcome to everyone to this webinar. Thank you so much for joining us. We will dedicate this webinar on COVID to the impacts of COVID-19 on road projects, financing, procurement, transparency, and due diligence. So our program today is I will make a short introduction to the webinar, then we will have procurement in post-COVID times, what and how, by Dejan Makovšek from the OECD. Then we will have mobility and recovery impacts of COVID-19 pandemic by Simon Gianordoli. Then we have the post-COVID projects acceleration strategy by Valérie Maltais from Quebec. And then we have a speeding up investment in public works in Italy from Fabio Pasquali from ANAS. Then we will have the new alliance improving infrastructure delivery through collaborative contracting and modern methods of construction. That will be presented by Raphael from Atkins. And then we will have what's in for developing countries from Michel Demarre from S.p.A. And then we will go for a Q&A moderated by Veronica Arias, technical advisor. So a few of housekeeping issues. First of all, you're all invited to switch off your cameras and microphones. Please try to do so. We are having this in a meeting form, so you can all chat with everyone you see over there. You can send private message, but the trade-off of that is that you have to switch off your microphones, please. And June Takeuchi and Veronica Arias will help me out with that. Yeah, thank you very much, June. You can ask your question at any time, so please do that in the chat, but we will take them, all of them, at the end of the session. And Veronica Arias will check all of them and ask them orally to the panelists. Since we will have quite a lot of participants, we will be able to answer a limited number of questions. So if you see your question already asked by somebody in a different way, please refrain from asking again and try to ask your most relevant questions. A couple of tips. First of all, we invite you to close the chat window so you can see the presentations on full screen. And we also invite you to choose to see only the speaker. If you go to the right side bottom, you will have the black menu that you have over there. And you put side by side speaker, you will see the speaker in a bigger size, and you will see not the other, and you will not see the other participants. Very quick introduction to the seminar. So once again, we are looking for your presentations. We are looking for your questions. So please ask them. Ask questions related to road and road transport, and most specifically to the theme of the webinar. Otherwise, we will not be able to answer them. Use the chat feature in Zoom. It's you can find it in the low bar menu. And please send it to all participants. But start your question by question 2 and put the name of the speaker. And this will be monitored by Veronica Arias and Duke Takeuchi. We recommend you that you rename yourself as first and last name and your country. That will foster interaction between participants, and maybe you can chat during the webinar. This webinar is being recorded. It makes part of PIARC policy on COVID-19 issues, and it will be shared in PIARC's website and YouTube channel. And the idea with these COVID-19 webinars is to be quick, try to be reactive, share knowledge among PIARC members as soon as possible. So some of them has not been confirmed as the best practices yet because they are just ongoing in the implementation. So there's a small disclaimer over there. Since time is of the essence, it is likely that knowledge and practice that is shared will not be officially approved by each country's official authorities. So we ask you to keep that on mind. And 2 slides to present PIARC. I hope all of you are familiar with what is PIARC, and you already know it, but just in case, Let me explain you. PIARC is the name of the World Road Association. It was founded over 100 years ago in 1909 as a non-profit, non-political association. And our goal is to organize exchange and knowledge on all matters related to road and road transport. Today, we have 125 member countries, plus several thousands of collective and individual members. We have 4 key missions: being a leading international forum for the analysis and discussion of the whole spectrum of transport issues related to roads and road transport. Identify, develop, and disseminate good practices and give a better access to international information. Consider within our activities the needs of countries with developing economies and economies in transition, and to design and produce efficient tools for decision making. And how do we do that? Well, this is thanks to the expertise and experience of our 1,200 experts for more than 80 countries that joined the 25 technical committees as task forces of PIARC.
Several different sessions at our TRB annual meeting. I know that several of the organizations that are on this.
There we go. So we have already had over 30 webinars on COVID-19 issues and road related, all very different topics. So you can see them in our webpage. That's the link. You can see the recordings and the slides in the 3 languages. Well, here's some example of some of them, but as I was saying, we are covering almost every aspect of road infrastructure and road transport. And with that, I will just highlight the 6 issues that we have identified as the most relevant during this pandemic in the road infrastructure. One is to ensure as far as possible the health and safety of the employees and road users. It's to respond to the impact on transportation of this pandemic, to foster the relationships and collaborations with customers, users, and other interested parties during this pandemic, maintain activity and continuity of services, manage impacts on economy and supply chains, revive the economy after the crisis and create jobs in the short term, and be aware of the security issues, including cybersecurity. And with that, I will give the floor to our first speaker today, Dejan Makovšek. Thank you very much, Dejan. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Miguel. Can you hear me well?
Yes, perfectly.
If you can, so can the rest. It's a pleasure to be with you today, and thank you for the invitation. I have recently changed jobs and moved from the International Transport Forum, where I prepared a dedicated report on the what. And I will briefly go through a few slides in terms of how to invest for fast recovery in post-COVID times. And then I shall move into the how, which is a longer term question. So where I moved to is at the bottom of this slide. It's the new Infrastructure and Public Procurement Division at the OECD. Miguel, if you would, the next slide, please. So when the COVID began, the first response was about keeping all the essential services running. And now that we are slowly getting vaccinated, the question is how to speed up the economic recovery. There are some lessons and rules that have been learned from past crises. And the first point definitely is that if we really want to impact the recovery, the investment needs to happen relatively fast. Then, as always, when a large pot of money is on the table, there are questions that appear whether we can do something also really fast to shift towards greener, more resilient, more equitable. Can we play with efficiency? What can we do? And of course, the first question is, can we increase the volume of infrastructure investment? And this is not about how much money can we put into infrastructure, but how can we speed up, let's say, the preparation of projects and their delivery. Next slide, please. And next. So as I mentioned, several lessons were learned from this. We don't need to invent hot water in this one. And this is a nice figure or a table that was put together by the International Monetary Forum. And the high-level principles that were derived from past crises is that we should try to allocate resources to those projects which deliver the highest benefits. But we should not forget that there are also other groups of people that don't necessarily live in places with the highest economic density. And hence investing in infrastructure in, let's say, rural or country side won't deliver the highest economic benefits, but it will deliver the highest relative improvement to people living outside of the zones of highest economic density. And lastly, whatever we do, it should be fast and big enough. So if we want to really stimulate the economy, the investment or the boost in investment needs to be sizable. Now, all these things overlap with the point that our investment choices needs to be targeted. It needs to be timely. It needs to happen in the next 4 years. And we also should not forget that after our stimulus program is over, we should stop spending and start repaying the extra money that we have borrowed to spend now, which has proven a challenge for many countries in the past. Once the party starts, it's difficult to stop it. Next slide, please. So a few points that can be said about investment appraisal. Behavioral patterns by users, either road users or public transport users, may have been affected by the crisis. As you know, many of us are still teleworking. This may continue to be the case in the future for a considerate portion of employees. And also right before the crisis, there were changes in the behavior of users of public transport and roads. So a smart thing would be to quickly reassess the assumptions on which our projects were appraised right before the crisis. Second thing, if we really want to increase the volume of investment in infrastructure, we should not forget both the capacity issues in the public sector, who needs to prepare the project, and potential capacity issues on the construction market, where until recently there were, let's say, constraints with workers moving across borders. And these, let's say, there are multiple forces that work on the construction market, both in limiting its capacity and also, let's say, creating a slack in what the extent the construction market is employed. So this needs to be investigated. Next, please. A very important point is, in line with what was in the table before, there are multiple trade-offs that every country needs to consider when trying to increase the volume of investment into infrastructure. First is, there were several ideas how to abandon some of the steps in project preparation. And this may be, for example, trying to abandon a public consultation or another step. And these, let's say, these steps are there for a reason. So if we approach the problem of acceleration with an ad hoc approach, then we can obviously do more harm than good. For example, projects may later land in courts. There may be disputes that lead to multiple problems. So there isn't really a recipe for ad hoc acceleration of project approval. This needs to be a result of a systematic effort of how to optimize your processes, and this doesn't happen overnight. So point being, there's very little that we can do to actually accelerate project preparation. Then the next point is, as I mentioned before, if you want to achieve the highest cost-benefit analysis ratio, then you want to invest in those projects where the economic density is already high. And this is usually in the cities. On the other hand, as we can see with, let's say, recent trends in let's say, political tensions, the rise of populism, the threats to democracy, there is a case to also try to improve, to have a more balanced, let's say, investment allocation approach, where the objective is not only to increase income in the areas where income is already high, but also to improve the relative life of people living in other places of the country. And this needs to be a result of a political consensus. And this too cannot be changed overnight or very fast. Probably took years to get to any consensus that is in place right now. And the last trade-off is equity versus efficiency. So we can try to spend more money over the central government, but in many countries, the lower levels of authorities also have significant, let's say, spending capacities and needs. But one must be clear that there's also lower levels of capability that regional authorities generally have. And so the investment, trying to push more investment also to regional authorities may, by implication, also lead to less efficient investment. So that's also a trade-off to consider. Next, please. So capturing all the points in a very simple message, the best candidates for really ramping up investment into infrastructure that doesn't really infringe on the investment approval process and other points are maintenance projects. And the expectation that we can, let's say, jump over the planning procedure or abandon any points or the project preparation, not do a national master plan and so forth, exchange projects in the pipeline or change their nature or their objectives in a relatively short term is not realistic if we want to do it properly. It might be another issue for countries where these processes are not well developed and which didn't have, let's say, a national master plan for transport in the first place, or do not have a very good investment proposal process. But in that case, it's more a question of a technical assistance rather than trying to do something really fast without looking back. Next slide, please. So this was about a few very quick lessons about investment allocation, how to increase investment in post-crisis times and how to do that really fast. And the general message is that ramping up infrastructure investment is difficult because it is a rigid process that needs to take its time. Now, the key point which comes after that is how exactly we should invest. And this is something that we can fix relatively fast within the couple of years that are coming, but its implications are really much more long-term. So I would like to present briefly a recent advance that we are, a recent tool that we are piloting at my new division. And it's about how to improve not just road, but any infrastructure procurement process. And for that, I need to give you first a little bit of context. So next slide, please. Yeah, so in the past decades, projects grew by 2 to 3 times. And this has much to do with the fact that the in-house capabilities of the public sector in the pursuit of a lean public sector were pursued. So if you have less people, you can only manage fewer projects, and by definition, those projects need to become bigger. So more outsourcing of responsibility to the private sector. Some data became available on time and on budget performance. And this also became a political issue. And lastly, in the 1990s, perhaps in response to all these things, there was an expansion of alternative contracting models where ever more risk was transferred to the private sector. Next slide, please. if you go to any major procurement forum today, the discussion really is about delivery models and risk allocation. And it seems that this is a key discussion to be had in the strategy of how to procure. But is that the right question? That's the key point I will make in the next slide. Next, please. So this table is an illustration of a decision process that usually happens in advanced economies. They put on the top, it's a simplification. It could be much more complicated, but basically this is how it looks like. On the top, they would put different delivery models. And in the rows, they would put different criteria about what objective is more important to them than another. And the pluses represent not evidence, but perceptions, because we have very little evidence how different delivery models perform. They're perceptions about the performance of different delivery models. And while this method looks very practical, it's a bit of a self-deception. Because if you pick any one criteria as your top and most important criteria, that will also almost automatically lead you to select a single delivery model. But this leads to a major, let's say, leads to several major complications because it only represents one step of what a procurement strategy should be. Next slide.
Give me 1 second. I'm going to put it back.
Okay.
So we don't see the drawings that we had. There we go.
It's very interesting that we can see them.
Yeah, everybody can draw it. So if you can refrain from doing that, thank you.
Right. So you can see that these are the steps that people are usually discussing when they talk about what a procurement strategy should be. And you have a bidder selection phase, a delivery model discussion, and with that also an incentive power discussion, which is about payment mechanisms and penalties, incentives, basically. And the first point is scientific and enshrined in legislation. Delivery model discussion is based on tools such as the one I just presented. And the incentive power is basically predetermined by the choice of the model that we make. But there are important preceding decisions that need to be made that are missing here. So click, please. So what's missing here is that two very important decisions are made before we even get to the delivery model discussion. The first is the scope of your organization. What is it that you're buying from the market, and what is it that you're doing in-house? And the second is, should you procure the whole project as a single contract, or should you procure it through several contracts? Next slide, please. So let me explain first why this contract scoping and make or buy is so important. Let's imagine that your project is a set of activities and that each of these blue dots represent one activity. Please click. So you can procure all these activities as a single contract. Click again. And again. Or you could procure it as 3 contracts. But what makes it, what drives this decision? Click again, please. Let's say that one of these activities and another one, please click, are only delivered by 2 suppliers, while there are many suppliers for the other blue dots. What do you think will happen if I procure the whole project as a single contract? What will happen is that everybody would organize around these 2 suppliers, and we would get, instead of many bidders, we would get 2 consortia. And by inappropriately scoping this project, we have basically reduced the competitive power for all the other activities where there are many suppliers by not making the analysis how many suppliers are in for what activity, who is doing what. So there's an analysis that can be done to prevent that. Click, please. So I just mentioned how you can produce a competition failure. The next thing is you can also produce a failure called a holdup. Please click a button. Let's say that you have a supplier that is on your critical path, and the supplier, and you cannot write a contract that is foolproof. So there will be things that are happening that will drive you to renegotiate the contract and sit at him at the table. And basically what will happen is, as soon as you've signed a contract with the supplier, and if he's on your critical path, the bargaining power will change between the two of you. Imagine that you're building a sports stadium and your country needs the stadium for the Olympics. If you are late by building that stadium, there will be an international embarrassment for your country. And while the penalty that your supplier will have to pay if he's late will be comparably small. So whatever he wants, he will be able to get from you because the situation gives him a much greater bargaining power than he would otherwise have. So this is a situation of holdup, can also be studied and prevented before you scope your contract. And what you would normally do is you would take out the activities which lead to competition failures, you would take out the activities that lead to holdup, and you would sign a separate contract with those suppliers and nominate them to be used by others. Next, please. Next. So the last point, or the last mistake that countries are commonly making when procuring major projects is that no project is homogeneous in terms of risk and uncertainty. Please click a button. And again, so some activities will be relatively certain, some will involve a large amount of risk, but if you're scoping a major project as a single contract, you're very likely also applying a single risk allocation mechanism. And that's a mistake I would call one size fits all. So these are the types of problems for which you require an analysis to systematically prevent. And as of recently, such an analysis exists and can be taught and applied, and we are applying it in Norway on 2 road projects. Next slide, please. I will go very briefly and very fast to the next 2 slides just to give you a very general idea, but not explain any details because I think we're slowly running out of time. Next, please. So the first thing we do in our analysis is we break down a project into the blue dots that I mentioned before. And these are not tasks of the project because they can run into 10,000s and prevent any practical analysis, but there are specific rules how to derive, let's say, more abstract type of tasks. Second, we evaluate those activities via clear questions to determine specific properties of those activities that tell us whether we will get a holdup problem, whether we are going into a competition failure, or which activities should be together in terms of a similar risk allocation or treatment mechanism. And using that information, we sequentially inform the questions of contract scope, bundling across phases of projects. So should we have design and build? Should we have design, build, operate, maintain, or something else? And whether, of course, in which cases a collaborative approach might make sense. Next slide, please. So this is just an example of a major road project in Australia, which was broken down into 61 activities. There were many more tasks, but this is just to give you an example of how the analysis looks like. Next slide, please. There is a huge body of economic theory and evidence behind it that was built for decades, and many people won Nobel Prizes for it. We don't have time to tell you why these dimensions are important, but they inform which activities will lead into competition failures, hold up, or one-size-fits-all risk allocation, and why or how we should inform our contract scoping and so forth. Next slide, please.
Which is the next one, Dejan?
Yeah. Yes, please. Yes. So, so basically what happens is once we inform the activities and their characteristics, we put them into different types of, we put them in a model. And you can imagine that this is a wooden model with 6 compartments. And if regarding their characteristics, these activities fall into a, for example, the compartment number 4, then holdup will be a primary concern. If they fall in another compartment, they will have another primary concern. And this informs then the way the model works. Next slide, please. The whole process I've tried to illustrate is we try to determine the economic characteristics, which is the shape of the blocks. And then we put the shape that fits into the right compartment. Next, please. The process in practice looks like this. So you have 6, sorry, it should be 6 compartments, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And based on these characteristics, we put each activity into a particular compartment. Also more complicated to explain here, but let's move to the next slide. So in the end, what we want to achieve is we want to have a make or buy decision that is based on science and evidence. We want to have a contract scoping decision that is based on science and evidence. And only then can we start discussing the bidder selection delivery model and incentive power. And all these steps together is what represents a holistic approach to a procurement strategy. Because by not asking important questions before we go to the bidder selection and delivery model, we already condemn our project to some serious failures. Next. So ultimately what this means is we want to achieve lower cost. We want to have no increase or reduction in conflict and litigation with the contractor, so less problems. And we don't want to have a major loss in innovation potential. All these things because thinking about projects in terms of activities allow us a more targeted application of delivery model and risk allocation considerations. Thank you, I think.
Thank you so much, Dejan, for this great presentation. Almost a master class on procurement and also dealing with the strategies for investment. Thank you so much. I remind that if you have questions for Dejan or for the next speakers, please, you can put it on the screen, on the chat, sorry. We are monitoring it and we will deal at the end of all the sessions. Dejan has also kindly prepared a few more slides that we will put next week in the minutes of the seminar. You can find this recording and all the presentations from next week. Now we will move to our next speaker. That's Simon Gianordoli from European Road Federation, and he will tell us about mobility and recovery impacts of COVID-19 pandemic. Simon, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Miguel. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for inviting me and the ERF to present our research regarding the COVID-19 impacts on our sector. I'm Simon. I work for the European Union Road Federation, the representative trade association of road infrastructure companies in the EU. Next slide, please, Miguel. I am about to present you European comparative study conducted by ERF and its partners, namely the French Federation for Public Works, the European Construction Federation, and the French Road Association as well with ERF. To put some context on this work, our collective had already published an international comparative study in 2020 dealing with the impacts of mobility developments on the road infrastructure and its equipment. It was targeting 21 countries worldwide. So we published this past year. It was just before the COVID-19 outbreak, of course. Considering the breakthrough last year, we decided to further work through a more European approach this time to deal with the impact of the pandemic on mobility habits and behaviors, and reviewing the place of transport infrastructure and mobility policies into the European recovery framework. We are currently finishing the second study, and I will try to deliver today some preliminary results only. Next slide, please, Miguel. The study covers 11 countries. As you can see on the screen, we intended to cover different parts of Europe. We add as well the United Kingdom, as we figure out that the United Kingdom was a very interesting country, even it is not part of the EU anymore, and neither the EU recovery framework, of course. So we try to go in all relevant countries within the EU and the UK. Next slide, please. We organize our work around 4 axes. The first one is the impact of the COVID-19 crisis on mobility behaviors and habits in 2020. So we wanted to analyze what were the mobility habits just before, during, and after the crisis, even if the crisis is not over yet. We wanted to know what has changed, what were the impacts on passenger freight transports, namely on land transport. So we will not deal with this item today. I will not develop on it, but I can provide further information in the Q&A session if you would to. We concentrate also on the national recovery strategy. In 2020, most of the EU countries responded urgently with economic stimulus packages, and they went into a complete recovery plan or strategy in each country regarding the EU framework. We wanted as well to compare the existing national and EU strategy in transport and mobility fields to see what is the coherence between the ongoing and current strategies of before the crisis and the new priorities of the countries in the recovery plans. We wanted to know what is the link between the both, what's changed or not in each country. Finally, of course, we focused on the EU recovery framework. I will explain it a bit later in the presentation, especially the massive package that the EU members agreed on past summer. Next slide, please. Just before jumping directly to the results, I wanted to make a general economic overview of the construction sector, which has been quite impacted at the beginning of the crisis in Europe. As you can see on the screen, during the first wave of coronavirus crisis, the production in construction as a whole dropped by almost 12% in Q2 2020 compared to Q1 2020. We saw a very net rebound of more than 14% in Q3, showing the role of the industry in the recovery. More specifically, in civil engineering production, we had the same figures. The production fell by 9.2% and rebounded by more than 11%. So, regarding these figures, the construction sector has then the potential to be the wheel of the recovery and demonstrated its flexibility during the crisis. Restrictive measures in different countries did not affect construction company that much. If we see the whole 2020 year, it was a very difficult one, but the rebound is there. The growth is getting back slowly, and it is forecast for the next year in 2021, 2022. Now the real difficulty for the sector is more the rising prices on raw materials affecting different manufacturing industries with an unstable economic and sanitary situation, as we are not still all vaccinated. It affects also the road construction industry. Next slide, please. If we speak now more on the economic recovery in Europe, I will try in this slide to explain the EU recovery framework to explain it mainly. As some of you certainly know, the past summer, all the EU member states agreed on a massive package of 750 billion euros to start an economic recovery in all the European Union. The large program of it is the Recovery and Resilience Facility of about 672.5 billion euros. This amount is divided between grants and loans that will be provided to EU member states to foster the recovery in the next 5 years until 2026. The European Commission will start to borrow all of this money on behalf of its members. For doing so, all the EU members were supposed to submit a national recovery and resilience plan to the EU Commission at the end of April this year. The Commission will review these plans in the next 2 months. In all of these plans, the member states developed the project investments and the new reforms for the recovery. Obviously, to get access to this funding, some conditions were put on the table and written in the regulation. So, namely, for example, more than 37% of all investment projects in national recovery and resilience plans have to be channeled to climate objectives, to fulfill climate objectives. 20% as well have to be channeled through the digital transition. So more than half of each national plan have to be channeled through climate and digital objectives, as it is the two main objectives of the EU to reduce GHG emissions to be carbon neutral in 2050 and to ensure a complete digital transition of the economy. The member states are supposed to have a look on others member states' plans. So all of the EU countries will review the plans and approve them as well at the next EU Council at the end of June. Normally, if all the plans are approved, member states can ask for 13% of the funding in the next months in order to provide a fast implementation of the plans. I have to mention in link with this study that some of the plans have not been submitted yet to the Commission. We are still missing some of them. I think here of the Dutch plan. We have almost all of them. We miss maybe 3 member states at this time. Next slide, please. As said previously, the Recovery and Resilience Facility is composed of grants and loans to member states. For the time being, the member states are more focusing on grants in the national recovery plan instead of loans. Loans will be asked later on in 2022-2023. As you can see on the screen, all EU countries do not receive the same amount from the grants part of the RFF. Spain and Italy are supposed to get with almost 70 billion each, so they are the first beneficiaries from it. They are followed by France with 14 billion, Germany 25 billion. The repartition, the sharing of the funding of the grants part of RFF was decided regarding the economic impact on each country, the size of the country, the population, and other criteria, a bit technical, but I can go more precisely in the Q&A session if you would like. Next slide, please. So more specifically, when we go into these plans and we look at the mobility and transport part or layers, regarding the place of the road infrastructure in it, unfortunately, most of the infrastructure envelope is going to the rail infrastructure, namely national network, national rail network, or European freight rail, especially in public transport in large cities in all the countries. I think here of Italy, France, Germany, or Spain. Even if transport is very well targeted in almost all of the plans, road infrastructure is quite not considered. It is more seen as a costly and political mobility asset, even if concrete efforts are made on greening vehicle fleets, deploying a consistent charging infrastructure for EV vehicles, for example. However, it could also be tricky as the road infrastructure is already targeted in ongoing transport policies, so previous policies that are ongoing and they were before the COVID crisis I think here of Germany. So there are plans in some countries dealing with the road infrastructure. It is not the case at each time, but at least in the national resilience and recovery plans, we don't see much the road infrastructure in it. We see the rail, we see the active modes, we see an intention of modal shift from road to rail. We see a bit of cycling infrastructure sometimes in some country. I think here of Belgium and Flanders. But road infra is largely underestimated or even non-present in the plans. It is a bit less the case in some Central Europe countries. I think here of Czech Republic, which is more ambitious in new road projects. It has to be noted as well that many countries are proposing simplified rules and procedures regarding public procurements to accelerate project executions. I think of Italy, Spain, the UK. It is not very surprising neither, because the European Commission recommended that kind of reforms in its recommendations to each member states, at least for a large part of them. So it's not very surprising. We will have to see the implementations of those public procurement reforms. So we wait for the implementation still. Next slide, please. It is when we see that the road is not very considered, at least not new road projects, in the national recovery and resilience plans, we were a bit surprised, because of course, the road transport contributes to almost 3/4 of emissions in the transport sector in the EU. That is true facts and figure. Nevertheless, the infrastructure itself does not emit GHG emissions. That's the vehicles that are on it that are emitting emissions, CO2 emissions. So in that sense, greening the fleet and deploying an according recharging infrastructure is logical. But when we see all of the fundings going to the rail infrastructure, we were a bit surprised, because even if we go for a greater modal shift from road to rail, let's say about 10 or even 15% at maximum in 10 years, if we develop larger home working habits, if you reduce the place of private car in central cities, all of that measures that are going on. Even with that, the road transport will decrease, certainly, but remain dominant in transport, at least in land transport. 3 years ago, it represented already 80% of passenger transport, 70% of land freight transport as well. So road will remain at least majoritarian in land transport modal share. It will remain the first social network, and it have to ensure then the daily and safe mobility for EU citizens. We all remember at the first wave of COVID-19 in Europe that when we were all in quarantine and in confinement, the only way to get goods moving across the EU was road freight transport through the green lanes. So in that sense, road played its role. It has been very flexible, adaptable. We all see in larger city in Europe that the road had the capacity to adapt with new and temporary urban infrastructure or urban cycling lanes. So the road adapted to the situation and played its role. Considering the place that have the road infrastructure in the transport chain in Europe, and it is a very considerable economic asset, it needs then to be maintained properly, repaired, and funded in accordance with its role. Next slide, please. Doing so, several options are open to guarantee the effectiveness and the good shape of the road infrastructure. So we will go with some recommendations, considering our upcoming published report in the next months to the Europeans, toward the EU institutions. We think that new road infrastructure maintenance and rehabilitation projects should be launched after a chronic lack of maintenance investments over the last 10 years. If you go to the flow of investments in road infrastructure, in road projects in the past 10 years, you have some gaps between 1 and 5. in comparing different countries. If you take, for example, Spain or Germany, you have, or even France or the UK, you have gaps of 5 times of investments in several countries in Europe. The secondary networks, road networks, are in poorer conditions than they were in 10 years ago, for example. Going even on climate objectives or the reduction of GHG emission, we think that a road in a good condition constitutes a way of saving emissions. So our partners at the Spanish Road Association in the recent works and studies found out that a road in poor condition constitutes an increase of up to 10% in emissions from vehicle on the road. I don't even mention safety issues, but if you have a road that is well maintained, at least well maintained, you can save lives and emissions. So that will be not something that costly to have regular maintenance programs. And to secure the maintenance budget over the long term in Europe, we preconize the use of multi-annual maintenance and rehabilitation contracts that are based on performance. We think that it would be a suitable solution. I will take here the example of the UK and its National Road Investment Strategy. It's a large strategy period for the period 2020-2025, which is targeting all the major road network in the UK. But at least you have a certainty for over 5 years of what will be the works, what will be the cost, and what will be the works on the road sector. So we will defend this recommendation before the EU institutions in the coming months. Next slide, please. I'm over with this presentation. It was a very, very light synthesis, a little insight of our work. So I would be glad to respond all of your questions in the Q&A sessions later on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Simon, for this presentation and for keeping the time. And yes, you have already a few questions in the chat, interesting ones. And if anyone wants to add anyone, please do so. And we will take it at the end of the presentations. Thank you, Simon. Let's move now to our next speaker. This is Valérie Maltais from the Ministry of Transport of Quebec, and she will present us COVID-19 projects acceleration strategy. Valérie, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you, Miguel, and thank you everyone to be there today. I'll start. Do you have my presentation, Miguel? Thank you very much. You can take put the next one, please. So today I'll talk about the global pandemic and the impact of certain roadwork projects in the province of Quebec. So in March 2020, as you know, COVID-19 was declared a global pandemic, and it affected both our personal and work lives. And we all had to adapt to this new reality. So regarding roadwork, these changes involve the suspension of some work and delays in the preparation of several projects. Next one. Thank you. The government of Quebec has found ways to face this new major economic challenge. So today I will present how the Ministère des Transports du Québec has benefited from these measures. And I will give you the example at the end of the Highway 30 project. Next, please. Next, please. I will present you the act respecting the acceleration of certain infrastructure projects. So in fall 2020, the government introduced the act. The act comes from a government commitment to help compensate for the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. Its objective is to promote Quebec's economic recovery and to accelerate certain infrastructure projects. The act was passed on December 10th, 2020, and only applies to the provincial laws. So in Quebec, there are federal laws from the Canada's government, and there is federal law too, and this act only applies to the federal provincial law. Next, please. The provision of the Act in force until December 2025 or until the projects all completed. So only the project listed in the schedule at the end of the Act can benefit from the measures. So there's a list of projects that can benefit all the measures listed in the Act, and the projects are from the transportation, the education and higher education, and the health sectors. The Act respecting the acceleration of a certain infrastructure project provide for a biannual report plan. Next, please. The Act respecting acceleration of certain infrastructure projects there's 4 activities areas are targeted by the Act. The first one is the environment, and more particularly with respect to required authorizations. The second one is the real estate acquisition process. There's the authorizations for land use planning and development. And finally, there's the use of lands in the domain of the states. So the Act provides for very specific accommodations in these 4 areas. And once again, only for the project listed in the schedule. Next, please. Accommodation measures for environment aspects are divided in 2 components. The first one is certain processes applicable under the Environmental Quality Act. So in particular, those relating to the obligation to obtain a ministerial authorization to carry on activities has been adapted. So this means certain requirements have been removed. You can, next one. Thank you. And the second measure with regard to the environmental impact assessment and review procedure has been eased. Now I refer to all steps that have been taken to obtain or not the authorization to execution of a project for a project to reach the regulation respecting the environmental impact assessment and a review of certain project applies. Here the Bureau d'Audience Publique sur l'Environnement. So there's a bureau that will have some investigation on the environmental impact is one of those steps. Here's from the exception, the requirement to obtain an authorization under the section of forest were removed, which allows to simplify the characterization of wetlands and water body from work to which authorization must be requested pursuant to the section in force. Actually submit as contaminated land rehabilitation plan is in phase. Yeah, we can go to next. Thank you very much. The Act respecting the acceleration of certain infrastructure public also provide the acceleration of the environmental impact assessment and review procedure for certain infrastructure project to boost the economic by first one, reducing by more than half the time needed to process projects. Second one, focusing the procedure on the analysis issue instead of analysis level. Third, simplifying and combining 2 steps of the analysis. So admissibility of the impacts to the environment, accessibility of the project. That means that those 2 steps are combined so that it's simplify the procedure and accelerate it. Optimizing the BAP public consultation phase. So I remember you that the BAP is the bureau, is a kind of bureau that have the authority to analyze and conduct consultation by the environment phase. And finally, eliminating administrative delays and wait time. For example, for a project exempted for the environmental impact assessment and review procedure, the analysis required for the necessary environmental and authorizations will identify environmental issues and limit project impact. So there's several inventories like fauna, special status species, plant species, etc., and soil characterization will be conducted to better evaluate the environment protection measure needed. Next, please. It is important to note that while procedures are accelerated, it does not mean that they are facilitated. So the obligation to comply with the requirement of the Environmental Quality Act is maintained despite regulatory adjustment. So instead of having more an easy way to have those authorization, there's the obligation to get those authorization before going on the sites are maintained. Next, please. The measure for real estate acquisition now, the measure for real estate acquisition provide for a simplified expropriation procedure under the Expropriation Act. So the MTQ, the Ministère des Transports du Québec, has this responsibility for all the ministries. This simplified procedure involve in particular decreasing residential, commercial, agricultural, and industrial expropriation time by 9 to 24 months. It also makes it impossible to challenge the right to expropriate. And finally, the measures can change how to indemnity is set. Next, please. The exemption for government interventions for the application of the Act respecting land use, planning and development, as well as a simplified procedure to obtain municipal authorization or planned. So that means that with the collaboration of municipality, we can have simply just informed about the project instead of waiting for the authorization. And that means that we have to be really tight with the stakeholders. Next, please. In the minister, having authority over a part of the land in the domain of the state is enabled within 30 days before the beginning of the work. That must be undertaken in that part of those land to carry out an infrastructure project to grant the right necessary to carry out that work. The ministry may temporarily allow the work to be carried out on the condition the minister determines. So until the minister grants the necessary right, provide the work is not incompatible with the right previously granted on that part of those land or with any other related constraint. So that's a special right for those projects on the schedule of the Act. Next, please. So at the Ministère des Transports du Québec, the Transport Administration of Quebec, the project presented in the schedule of the Act respecting the acceleration of certain infrastructure projects were selected based on certain criteria. So that include the project progression, the project complexity, the community approval, the measures that make it possible to save time based on the project. So we had to save a minimum of 1 year. The maintenance of assets, the word safety and the mobility. So out of the 180 projects listed in the schedule, 51 of them are transportation projects. As previously mentioned, the other projects are mainly for the education, higher education, and health sectors. Next. While, thank you. While the government has taken measure with the act respecting the acceleration of certain infrastructure projects, the Ministère des Transports also had to think about other ways to benefit from these relaxations in order to accelerate the start of specific projects. Project execution strategy are among the solutions identified by the Ministère des Transports du Québec. Carrying out work by lots, meaning the lots to be prioritized are those in the later stage or without critical activities to be carried out in order to accelerate the start of the project. Second one, advancing the preparation of plan and specifications by finding the solution more quickly and relocating utilities during the work instead of before the beginning of the work, which accelerates the start of the project. It should be noted that accelerated project planning must take into account the time to obtain authorization under federal law, as these are not subject to any specific acceleration measure. As I remember at the beginning, I said that there's two type of law in Quebec. So there are the federal law that's under Canada, and the second one on provincial law under Quebec. So only the provincial law can benefit from those measures instead of the federal laws. Next, please. For the contractual component, the Minister launched call for tenders for contracts in cascade. This type of call for tenders involve two projects or more of the same scale and with similar work to be carried out. The best tender will be awarded the contract with the highest amount, and the second best, the second contract, and so on. So this will save time to for the preparation, of course, and the preparation of specification contractual procedure, because we're just doing it once. It will also give the market a more comprehensive view of the potential contracts and help them to plan the tenders. The minister also implemented an internal measure to process specific file first. And finally, a working committee were formed to optimize internal mechanism. To meet the objective in accelerating the startup project, the Ministère des Transports made sure to manage stakeholders in a proactive and consistent manner, better follow-up of future meetings with the ensure to share as much information as possible within the organization, and also the addition of in-house resources has been key in meeting these objectives. There are very ambitious objectives, so there's a lot of resources needed to conduct those projects. Next. I will finish with the example of the Highway 30 project. Next, please. So the Highway 30 project is the preparation of repair and enhancement project between the Highway 10 and Highway 20. Is one of the best projects to demonstrate how the measure of the acts respecting the acceleration of certain infrastructure project could be applied, in addition to of the action of the Ministère des Transports has been taken. The purpose of the Highway 30 enhancement project, which extend on approximately 20 kilometers, is to improve mobility and accessibility of the Greater Montreal area. Actually, the act allows substantial time saving. The plan specification stage has been advanced. The call for tenders has been taken in cascade, of course, and a solution that forces community approval. So in addition to all the measures allowed by the Act, the Minister has benefit for all the measures that I've talked about today. So actually, this project can save several years about the beginning of the project. So it's an excellent example of how we can save times by using different strategies to be on site before really early as it was planned at the beginning. Next. So we can see here the examples. So at the beginning, we have planned to work something like 5 or 6 years later than it is actually planned. So we have designed the first lot, the lot 1, right after the call for tenders. Like I said, the contract is in cascade, and the call for tenders for lot 1 and work 1 will be identified and powerful for other lots and for the old project. So we are working on the first lot and the rest of the project at the same time. And actually, the work for tenders are in preparation for the first lot. Next. So it's the end for me today. So if there's some question, it will be a pleasure to answer your question at the end.
Thank you very much, Valérie, for your presentation. And it's very good to have a concrete example of how transport administrations are dealing with this situation of financing and procurement during COVID pandemic. Thank you so much. I'm sure there will be questions. We have already a few, but please don't hesitate to ask in the chat questions to Valérie. Thank you. Let's move to our next speaker. This would be Fabio Pasquali from ANES, but he's also the chair of PIARC Technical Committee on Social Economic Development. And he will be speaking today about speeding up investment in public works in Italy. Fabio, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Miguel. And here you can find the picture that we took in Paris when we had the kickoff meeting of the TC I'm chairing. Well, just before the pandemic, it's years and years now. Well, thanks to CEDAR for organizing these webinars, which helped us that much in this hard period, and also thanks to Michel Demarre and the other speakers and the attendees for this. I'm the head of planning of ANES. ANES is the Italian state water agency with a network for about 27,000 kilometers. I will go back on some figures related to what we are discussing today. Next, please. Well, I will not spend some time about the resilience and recovery facility because the previous speaker was very brilliant in explaining all that. I would focus on the role of Italy or the way Italy is benefiting from it. On the right side, top side, you see the summing up of the criteria which are the basis of the plan. An injection of innovation, circular economy, and resilience, and the strategy which is behind the program is to allow countries to recover as fast as possible, and also to take the occasion of the pandemic to help some countries to try and solve some of their structural problems. You remember that it's been explained by Gianordoli, the best benefiter, the countries which benefit more are Italy and Spain. And you see on the top left the total amount of the program which is getting to Italy. It's in excess of 200 billion euros. And the evidences with respect to infrastructure for sustainability. As we know, there are 6 core areas in the resilience and recovery facility, and each country state has to prepare a national plan, and this all the actions and projects included in the plan must be completed by 2025. and 26. And for some earmarked sectors, green transition, digital transformation, you see that about more than 50% of the FX is related to that. Next, please. Okay, great. Well, this is the focus on infrastructures, and the source is the Ministry for Infrastructures and Sustainable Mobility. The name has been changed just in occasion of the new government that was created in Italy last February. And you see that about 1/4, about 25% of all the finance available will be devoted to infrastructures. And you see the four core topics or criteria on the right side: digitalization, revolution, infrastructure. But you see that about 2/3 are really devoted to infrastructures. And among them, rails represent a big proportion, but also ports and also water infrastructures and urban mobility related to sustainable transportation and also transportations. Roads are not financed. The only credit line, grant line, sorry, that we get from the whole program comes from an additional fund which has been added up by the Italian government of 30 billion euros. And Italy is, ANAS is getting about $500 million for the digitalization of the roads and tunnels and structures, in the sense that we are going to carry on the so-called digital twin program. We are going to collect data. First of all, we will install sensors on each of our 18,000 bridges and structures. And then we are going to create a digital twin, and we will analyze the behavior of the twin, and we'll compare it with the behavior of the actual bridge. And if anything goes wrong, we have the tool to quickly understand. It's a developer or a component of the asset management, as we all know. What is also interesting is that this is the occasion for the government just to inject policy and finance in order to encourage the green transition. Next, please. Now let us get to the core of the contribution that I've been asked for. Well, on the top part, you may read an extract from a survey which is carried on a regular basis by the European Commission, by comparing the procurement public contract code or public procurement law in all countries of the Union. You see, Italian public procurement law is strongly oriented towards formal elements, these are resulted in a lengthy, complex, and onerous procurement code, which contracting authorities and economic operators have difficulties to work with. As a result to this diagnosis, just in 2016, Italy has changed its public contract code by adopting the new EU rules. But we can say that almost every year after 2016, we had some improvements or amendments to the public contract law. The most important amendments relate to the most economic advantage tender, which has been considered as compulsory in all complex tenders, and this has also allowed to use this criterion in more cases, or almost in all cases, with respect to the best price, which does not allow for a better selection of the quality of the component, as we all know. Then there has been a certain limitation of the use of negotiated procedure without previous publication of call for tender, and then a couple of general decisions aimed at improving the sector in general terms. A system of qualification aimed at reducing the number of contracting agencies. Some of them are not that professional or not skilled in terms of people, of course, small municipalities, for instance. And then the establishment of a rating system or vendor rating system, which is a premium for companies based on their previous performances. And then we try to introduce some soft loans or secondary regular instruments, sort of guidelines. We've been trying to make them work, but well, the results were puzzling. Next one, please. This is part of the legacy. As you see, Italy is at the bottom in the trend of GDP, top left, and we are unfortunately, as it has been said, at the bottom of private investment and public investment. Well, we all know, and Dejan provided us with a very brilliant introduction about it. Public investment infrastructure is a strong tool for relaunching the economic system, but it's usually associated also to some negative effects. First one is the fact that it is the if you launch a huge public investment program, you have to finance it, and it has some effects on the fiscal system and the private company is not encouraged to invest. And in addition to that, a limit of this program is that it takes time, as it has been said, to put in place the investment from the initial decision of the government up to the moment in which the public works are really operating in the specific place where it has been projected or decided. Well, it takes a lot of time. And then another problem is that there is the possibility that the public finance that is collected by the government is going to get into competition with the private sector. In this case, we can say that we are in very good conditions. First, because there is a very high percentage of grants in the RR facility, and then there is a rebound post-COVID. Now we are growing about 4 to 5% GDP per year projection of 2021. So we should be safe with this point of view. The core problem is that, as we saw, it is necessary to carry on this investment and to complete them by 2026 if we limit to the investment included in the National Resilience and Recovery Plan. But we have some other 100 to 150 billion of investments already financed by the government in traditional sectors, such as roads and others not included in the next one, please, in the National Plan 4. What has been done to overpass this program? Next, please. Let us concentrate on the legislative innovations, partly decided last year, partly in 2019, and then next slide we will discuss what has been approved by our government 5 days ago. So what we have been carried on, just simplification in the award of contracts for services and supplies, not without call for tender. Just this is valid, but just for very small contracts with a very small amount. What is more important is that it has been introduced the simplified award of contracts with negotiated procedure, so without open tender, in some cases without prior publication of the notice, by inviting 5 to 15 operators depending on the thresholds. The thresholds is always the European Union one. We are not overpassing them, of course, but the simplification consists on selecting companies that performed well, and then there is a formal tender in order to award that contract. Then a number of reductions that you can read to yourself without reading all of them. Well, which are the areas? The areas are the area of decision and recommendations. We all know that many of the administrative bodies intervene during the tendering phase. In some cases, we have projects in which we have 23 different permits that we have to get. I mean, we as a road agency. And in some of these 23 stages of procedure, we are out of the picture in the sense that in most of those cases, we have to wait until other bodies take their decision, and then we follow up with our own decision. And the second area is the area of litigation after award to the preferred bidder, and litigation also during the execution of the contract. And the idea is to work towards a better collaboration, and in some cases by allowing the tenderer to see its rights defended and represented, but at the same time the tender is awarded, and then we are going on with the contract, and then we are waiting for the judge, because it takes also 1 to 2 or 3 years for some cases in order to have the final decision, which is based on 2 degrees of judgment. And then full dematerialization. And then the last one is the procedural inversion, that is for most for the MEATS. First, we pass through the technical assessment, and only for the preferred bidder, the first one, and in some cases the first one and the second one, we pass through the administrative assessment of the process of the qualifications. Next, please. Let's get now to the last contract that we have that has been approved last Friday, and it became directly law Monday of this week. The governance of the national plan for resilience and reconstruction has been created. It's based on a number of bodies. First of all, a control room coordinated by the Premier, and the composition changes according to the project. We have seen that the national plan covers 270 pages, and there are many projects with different players. The second body is the unity for the improvements of the regulation, because it's a core aspect of the sectors that are affected by the PIARC regulation, of course. A permanent consultation table for the partnership with the role of consultation of the social parties, a centralized office for monitoring of anti-corruption. This is nothing of this is new. All these activities have been carried on by specific bodies, but in this case there is a coordination unit which takes control over what is going on. Then, very important, the possibility of a central administration to step in if the responsive body is inactive or in case of denial of authorization or opposition. There is a stronger will of the government, and this is also this has been also considered in the past. But in this case, if the administration is not active enough, well, the government will step in. And then an interesting thing related to the environmental impact assessment, which has also been described by Valérie just a few minutes ago. The government has decided to create a new body for assessing this aspect of project control for the projects included in the plan. We are in the typical de jure condendo situation, in the sense that law is being created. We don't know yet if this is going to substitute the other one for these projects, and what is going to happen for the other one. And then, which is very new for Italy, which was very strict in allowing subcontracting, which has been decided to allow for up to 50%, and before the end of this year, 100% of subcontracting will be possible. But the awarding agency had the possibility to specify in the tender documents the cases in which the company, the preferred tenderer who would sign a contract is going to ask it to directly execute some act. Last and next slide. Slide, please. Well, this is a special moment for Italy, but not only for Italy, because we are at the same time 4 conditions. The first one, huge financial resources available. The second one is a strong commitment in control and instruments created by the government and adequate governance. contemporary reforms, because you know that the European Commission asked for reform in contemporary respect to the make it available the finance, and then reinforcement of the public administration through a special program of national qualified human resources. Well, there is a very lot to do, but just let me spend the last 2 words in giving you some figures about ANAS, about how difficult can be to award contracts. Well, in 2021 and 2022, we are going to have investment for 4.6 billion investments and tender on the value of 12 billion euros. I myself have been chair of the commission, awarding commission in the last weeks. Well, for a single contract of 40 million, we had 10 meetings, and there were 3 companies for each of the lot. Well, you may imagine how long we have been passing for a meeting. And this was 40 millions, and we award every year in excess of 3 to 4 billion. Well, it will take time, and I'm sure that what is very important is what has been said several times. We have to intervene in all the specific sections of the procurement chain. We need innovation, and we need to be very active in the circular economy transition. Procurement is a great tool for getting these goals, but it's very difficult to combine together. Well, I just talked to you about 3 years or 4 years of procurement law in Italy with some figures. You can see how it may prove difficult to actually award and build and carry on and implement an ambitious investment program. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fabio, for this great presentation on Italian landscape, which, as you say, it's probably very similar to other European countries. Thank you so much. Very complete presentation. Probably you have raised some issues, so don't hesitate to ask to Fabio your questions in the chat, please. Let's move to our next speaker now. This is Paul Raphael from Atkins Equity, and
hello.
He will, hello Raphael, hello Paul, and he will talk us about the new alliances, improving infrastructure delivery through collaborative contracting and modern methods of construction. Paul, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks, Michel. Okay. Yes, got the slide. Thank you. Good afternoon or good evening, everyone, depending on which part of the world you're in. I am Paul Raphael, working with Atkins Equity as an associate director for Capital Projects Advisory. This is within Atkins and SNC Lavalin. I have around 15 years of experience in the capital projects advisory, with my last 6 years in the Middle East. Right now I'm based in Dubai in the UAE. Very recently, this has been some of my passion, and that's a subject that we're discussing today. I had co-authored and released a white paper on new alliances and how collaborative contracting is relevant in the projects market for the Middle East, where the focus is on really connected construction with a common digital thread, where project outcomes should be the focus. And this is possible through collaboration rather than managing individual delivery contracts. And the subject has been discussed in the past through various insightful reports. One particular one I could pick up is on the Mark Farmer study on productivity that discusses on how we must modernize or we will die in the perils of the construction industry. These are very strong words there, but it's a very useful document to understand how it actually inculcates a particular requirement to change the way we are functioning today. And this emphasizes more on how important is collaboration and an improvement culture, that is absent in the construction industry. Hope I could throw some light on the subject today and possibly have a better chance of how we could survive here. The agenda slide, please. It's already. So in my few minutes that I have, I would give a short update on the COVID-19 on a global element, as well as a few feedback on what's happening in the Middle East, where we are based. To set the tone, my next subject would be on the traditional delivery model and throw some highlights on what are the key project challenges. For any change to happen into collaboration and collaborative contracts, we need to know why are we doing it, or why do you want to change the norm per se. And then there are a few steps on how you believe, or we could think of setting up a collaborative model, because where we are today in the traditional construction mindset in most of our projects, to reach to the Zen on the collaboration, or where we have advanced risk project alliances, or in Australia, the guidelines which are referred to collaboration. There could be a few tools that we need to reach there. And I hope I could show that and discuss that today. Any new tool needs an enabler, and I would highlight how different enablers on KPIs, value for money tracking, especially on stakeholder engagement and senior management endorsement is also key for collaboration. And then I would touch upon how a collaboration or integrated program delivery, which is really the overall life cycle, and where collaboration is an important part, is going to impact how modern methods of construction could benefit, especially on where there is time and cost and quality parameters are being challenged from the norm today. And lastly, I would touch upon how the benefits are for using the collaborative models. Next slide, please. So just a quick update on the COVID-19 pandemic. I know this was probably discussed in the earlier part of the call. Just to mention is that the pandemic continues to spread and cause illness, hospitalization, and deaths around the world. And to date, there have been around 160 million recorded cases, a likely substantial underestimate, and approaching around 3.5 million deaths. With various lockdowns and restrictions on economic and social activity, as well as the beginning of mass vaccination in many countries, the extent of infections and deaths is now sharply declining, especially in the Europe and North America. However, the situation remains acute in South America, with a strong resurgence in India and potentially affecting Southeast Asia, driven by the new variants. In a nutshell, while we are starting to turn the tide on COVID-19, some regions can see a line of sight to the end of lockdowns and restrictions, and the world as a whole has some way to go in bringing the pandemic to an end. It may now be well into 2022, really, that the global victory over coronavirus can be declared, and anything like normal life can resume everywhere. Next slide, please. Thank you. And in our region, basically the Middle East, within the 6 countries of the GCC, we have seen over 1 million COVID-19 cases, around 10,000 deaths. Whilst this is a tragedy, this is a much lower incidence of cases and particular deaths when adjusted for population. Cases are now below their peak in 2020, and countries are increasingly vaccinating their resident populations, with the UAE in particular leading the world in this area. Whilst infections fluctuate from country to country, the region can see its way towards a substantial easing of the pandemic in the second half of 2021. Although with economic and social impacts likely to last much longer, promoting the need for economic stimulus and acceleration of economic reform. Next slide, please. Thank you. Yes, now, just before I get to the challenges, as I mentioned in my agenda, it is worthwhile to mention some of the facts. For example, Productivity in the construction industry has been a flat line for over 25 years, actually, while in the wider economy, an average of 30% of productivity has been achieved. And in terms of digital transformation, construction ranks only above hunting and fishing in terms of the degree of digital transformation. So not so incredible numbers that we have as a baseline. So some of the common challenges that we are facing and has the most impact during the initial stages of the project lifecycle. For example, design often commences before the user requirements are fixed, leading to construction starting whilst the design is still in a flux and is often incomplete and not properly coordinated between the disciplines or the various consultants and outside influential stakeholders. For example, we have in the Middle East called the authorities and obviously in other regions as well, while there is a bit of delay happening when you have not provided information accurately enough. Designers and contractors take on projects that change significantly in scope during the respective periods, and thus resulting in delays, claims, and disputes. And this again impacts the delivery program and the final value of the investment. The industry is slow to adopt, for example, new and more efficient technologies as tight budgets and that they hinder investment in research and development. With the current adversarial contracts in place, there are no incentives for parties, for example, to identify or address problems early or outside of their contractual boundaries, as the parties will believe that any solution development can increase the overall costs for them to execute. And in the same lines, certain behaviors that we are unable to keep a check on. For example, contracts start only when the predecessor has completed the activity, as there is no motivation, say, for example, to advance or pre-order components, considering the adversarial contracts that one is already in is just protecting your own interests right now. And lastly, and this is particular over here in the Middle East, the fragmented nature of construction sector. It just makes it is so difficult to retain and share lessons learned and retain staff, I would mean. So knowledge is lost, and as the project teams, they get disbanded, and then can imagine the firms begin their processes right from scratch. And a few others which are there in terms of whether you've got your a mismatch on the BIM technology, for example. So you're looking at various client contractors and consultants. They're all having various levels of technology that's been built in. And then suddenly you realize that as an owner or a developer, they're all getting disparate information and data collection. So in all of this, we do appreciate that the traditional model, probably we're saying it, not that it just contributes to all of it, I'm just saying is that there's always a hand in place of how we can improve these situations. And more particularly is where we believe is on collaborative contracting. And I'd give a bit more information about that going forward. Next slide, please. This is a very, and you can imagine this is as old as almost 22 years in the past. It's just to give an example to say that all your changes or modifications to design is always so easily influential and could be modified in the early stages of the program. Mostly in the traditional contracts, what happens is that the changes, or you can say the effort estimate on building or changes these drawings is happening at a later stage. And at that point in time, it's so difficult to control your cost, while the cost of design changes is impacting your overall program. So in all endeavor of which you're going into collaboration and changing your delivery model, you just want to make sure that you're making the right decisions and you're supporting and supporting an environment where all your inputs and insights is coming right up in the program definition stage and as well as in the design and development stage. Next slide, please. So these are a few steps which I have enumerated, and it has been successful and useful in some of the projects which have been delivered in the Middle East. Now, as you see in the top, the client and the consultant and the contractor, each of them would have an individual contract in place. Now, what we propose is not necessarily that you would have a collaborative contracting right from the beginning. It is possible that there are certain, you can call it a sick project or projects which is not performing well. And especially because of the disparate responsibilities between the contractor and consultant, that we're not, or the client is not able to achieve their end goal. And in this scenario, what we're suggesting is that before we start preparing or designing a collaboration model, we need to start looking at the basics of how the project is. And in the first step, you can call it as more of project readiness. Now, this may happen that this could happen any time of your project life cycle. And that's the flexibility of how this tool could support. So this could say that if your project is already halfway down the line, you may still want to step back and understand your project status. You may have a revised delivery program that you may have to prepare. And especially you should need to have a look at your financial model as well. This would actually set up your basics right in the beginning. And it would also support your client or developers to really identify what's the value that they want from this project. And it will also support in creating your second step, which is shown of articulating your delivery outcomes and creating your value definition for your project. This should happen in all probability with your stakeholders, and stakeholder engagement is not just within the contractor and consultant party. It should be especially with your users and operators, and at times you may also need your authorities as well. And once you've been in that frame of identifying your benefits and outcomes, you should define these KPIs, and which would really call more for value for money rather than just having a statement of closing a time and versus cost project. The third step is where we're talking about the behaviors and capabilities. Now, in a collaborative environment, I would say it's been done for large infrastructure projects, but there has been instances where we don't find a leadership commitment on the same. And this is particularly important because collaboration, we are turning the boundaries of having a contractual form, no doubt, but there are principles of having, so you call it an alliance management team, where you have members of the leadership from your developers, from your consultant, your lead contractors, and some of your specialized contractors who need to be there as part of your team. All of this requires a high-performing team in terms of cultural and behaviors. It's also a complete different mindset of change of what you need to imagine based on your traditional construction methodology. And now we would like to actually build upon an ecosystem for an integrated delivery model. And this actually is setting up your you can say a foundation towards now designing your collaboration model. And just highlighted just now, we were talking about organization model versus a commercial model. Now, this really requires to define your management team, and you may call it a collaborative management team, where you have key members from the various stakeholders. In all this, you cannot avoid an integrator partner, and the delivery integrator should more longer be called as a constructor, rather than being sometimes referred to as a contractor or a consultant. Last but not the least step is to have clear defined measurement criteria for you. And this would actually allow where your target outturn cost has been defined, and your share and your pain and gain share model can be defined for your risk assessment as well. In all probability, when you're defining your steps within these 4 to 5 areas or steps in your program, you're more so likely to have a strong delivery integrator program assigned for yourself. Next slide, please. And well, I've just gone through the steps here in the previous slide. Here, I would like to focus on what are the enablers to what are the enablers for collaborative contracts. And it's been reduced into 4 steps. The first and foremost, as I mentioned, is on getting your project features defined. And that would support how your collaborative model can be maximizing. So for example, you may want to include understand your specialized contractors that needs to come in place. And so we have in Dubai the famous Dubai water fountain. It was so important at point that you had to get the contractor who was supplying for the fountain aspects of the project and bring them up to speed before your infrastructure works are conducted. So those your project definition and project requirements has to actually be clear in the beginning of the project, and then deduce a program of how you would like to maximize the benefits. The second most important is defining the value for money, or the KPIs for your project. And this actually comes to the next step on having a pain and gain share, when you say for a risk and a reward mechanism. Now, if you have your defined KPIs clear, it is more likely that you may create a risk model where it has more balance between the developer, contractor, and consultant. Usually, generally, in the traditional models, the risks are mostly passed on to the contractor and consultants. And that's the first step, where you begin as a contractor to start safeguarding your own risks and own interests. This is where it's important that in the next step, you're looking more into the owners and the project stakeholders' involvement. If you want a successful collaborative contract model, you should definitely have your owner by your side. And this may be the CEOs for the developers, the consultant and contractors, and having some key stakeholders such as your authority approvals right before you. And this is in particular when I come to the next page is later on, is on the modern methods of construction, where in certain geographies, especially in the Middle East, the authorities are still grappling to understand how these, say for example, design for manufacturing assembly components and elements are equated to a traditional form of delivery of a building or a villa. Last but not the least is in your team, it's not just the owners and the right project stakeholders or from the client side, you also need the right contractor and consultant mindset. But, in many occasions in similar forums in the webinars, I did get some pushbacks at some contractors. They always said that it may not necessarily go for collaboration. We could still go for a traditional methods of construction and they can still make them their margins. I think it's more sometimes myopic in nature when one or few of them has this view. Going forward in the future, you have to be more collaborative in nature. And these are actually, this has been actually accelerated since the pandemic times. Next slide, please. This is a single view of how your modern methods of construction and how important is collaborative contracting, especially if you're looking for future design for manufacture and assembly, and having automation in the field of construction, in the field of construction and build. Right at the top, as you see, is we're creating a program delivery partnership, or you may call it a national virtual production hub, which has visibility right down to your supply chain and the manufacturing facilities. While it's so important that in the beginning stages of the program, you have your feasibility planned in a way that your model or your business model is understanding what the supply chain framework would be. I can give an example about this. We, in the Middle East, we did venture to go forward affordable housing for the local nationals here. It was very sensitive in nature, definitely. However, what happened is when the models and the different designs were prepared for the villas, they call it the traditional villas and the modern villas, it was so difficult to really predict what would be the volume that would, or a throughput of villas that would be constructed in a year. It actually compounded with the pandemic in the last year, where the volumes of almost say 200 or 250 villas just came down to 20 villas. Yes, this was an aberration in terms of situation and time, but it actually, it snowballed to the supply chain as well. The supply chain had provided framework rates and figures expectedly in 2019, end of 2019. But then eventually when the projects trickled through and their economies of scale of 250 became 25 to 50 villas, definitely there was already a conflict, or you can say a not so pleasant situation between the contractor as well as the developer. So it's a lessons learned, we can say. And what we expect in the future is that whenever a massive undertaking, when you want to go, especially in the modern methods of construction and the DFMA space, we must keep in mind how the supply chain would react and how the supply chain has to be part of the program rather than just being on the outside. As we spoke about the coordination with the supply chain, we have also prepared or imagine you can always have design components being standardized. In some of our examples, especially the UK, where we are using some of a design library of components. Yes, this has been offshored to India, where most of the designs have been prepared into components, and a design library has been created in such a way that for future designs, this design library would be most used for different components or parts that needs to be contracted or constructed. Now, if you can imagine in the Middle East, we are going to start off with that same design library that was created for the UK market. That's how powerful, if you see of how technology can play into this. So you may prepare design which is accelerated in nature. And when I say that, it's because you will expect that some of the authorities would have a pre-approval on those designs. And those designs in the future, after the pre-approval, are more specific to a specific facade requirement or a different look and feel that a client that needs, in a way that actually shortens your period on design. After that, you would provide the inputs to your supply chain, who's eagerly waiting for those 250 villas to be constructed. When the supply chain gets this information, they would step back and tell you, yes, these were the specific designs and specifications that we finalized in the initial stages of the program. Here you go. This is the delivered product from my production hub. And it's most importantly, this should be visible. The production hub capacity is visible to the client, such that they are able to figure out, all right, out of the 4 supply chains for my panels, I could go for 3 to 4 supply chain members, just looking at the capacity that they have. This way, it becomes a more concerted effort where the integrator at the top pulls the golden thread through. Yes, and ultimately, we would expect when your plan is correct, there would be more of assembly and handover, which is more of a process that has been streamlined almost along the years. Yes, I would, looking at the time that we have, I would like to go to the next slide. I would just touch upon the benefits of collaborative model, and this is compounded with the modern methods of construction, obviously. At a high level, you can always reduce 30 to 50% of your time that's been saved. And this is more so where you're going into the DFMA mode and constructing where most of the construction is done in your factory environment. You can achieve 5 to 15% savings. And yes, this, as I said, in a collaborative environment, you're finalizing the design much earlier in the play. So there's less wastage for the contractors on going forward. And lastly, you're looking more of improving your other KPIs, which includes health and safety, where in a factory setup, you're much more organized and you're making sure that no slip-ups are there and lesser accidents and others could happen at site. I would leave it at this at the moment. We would always mention, and I'm sure there would be more questions coming as we speak. I would give it back to you, Miguel.
Thank you very much, Paul, for this presentation. Very good. Difficult to keep it in the time that we allocated, but very interesting. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Let's move now to our last speaker today. He's Michel Demarre from S.p.A, and he will be talking about what's in for the developing countries. So, Michel, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Miguel. Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can, perfectly.
Good. So I think it was important to have also in consideration developing countries because, and PIARC is fully aware of that, it is not easy to involve members and representatives from developing countries to participate in PIARC activities. So I think it was just important to have a look at their situation and needs, considering the impacts of COVID on road projects. Next slide, please. This is an introduction for myself. I'm a kind of mixed public and private guy, but I've always been a member of PIARC, even when I was in the public sector, and I participated in 3 technical committees. I was president of the French National Committee, and I'm now the French-speaking secretary of Task Force 1.1 on well-prepared projects. And this is why I wanted to make this presentation, which I will make on behalf of S.p.A. What is S.p.A? Next slide, please. S.p.A is the Confederation of International Contractors Associations. In a short word, it's a business organization, a global business organization for the construction business, with a head office in Paris and members all over the world. What is relevant here is that since the inception of the pandemic, S.p.A has been collecting COVID-19 related information from their members and regarding many topics related to the legal constraints, the legal requirements, health issues, and so on. In the beginning, it was on a weekly basis. Now it's still published on a monthly basis. And if you want to have information on a global scale, you can have a look at S.p.A website. Next slide, please. I was faced with the difficulty to speak about developing countries on a variety of topics, procurement, financial issues, pandemic, governance, and so on. So my presentation will be a bit like a impressionist figure, but I will try to shed some light on these various issues. So first, what are we talking about? What kind of developing countries are we talking about? In our task force, we have a Chinese member, and sometimes I produce some statements on developing countries, and he tells me, oh, no, this is not true, because in China, it does not work that way. Yeah, admittedly, China is a developing country, but different from low-income countries, and not all developing countries are equal regarding road project preparation, and even less the pandemic. So my presentation will focus more on low-income countries, lower middle income countries, typically. Typically, many of such countries are sub-Saharan countries. Out of 29 low-income countries, 21 are sub-Saharan countries, that is with a gross national income lower than $1,000. And out of 50 lower middle income countries, 18 are sub-Saharan countries with a GNI between $1,000 and $4,000. So you see that the total 21 plus 18 is 39 SSA countries. I think the total of SSA countries is in the range of 46 countries. So you can see that the majority of sub-Saharan countries are either low-income countries or lower middle-income countries. Next slide, please. If we look at the COVID status, we can get some rather optimistic views from the OECD. For instance, here there is a figure with the a global economic recovery possibly in sight, but you see there are different scenarios. And obviously vaccine rollout is gaining momentum, yes. Government stimulus is likely to provide a major boost to economic activity, yes. But the upside scenario, the most optimistic one, is based on fast deployment of vaccines around the world and also fast release of pent-up savings. Those economies, those monies that were not spent during the pandemic. So this is the optimistic scenario. Downside scenario is based on slow production and deployment of vaccines. So this is an OECD, I would say, global projection. But next slide, please. The situation is less rosy for sub-Saharan countries. I don't know how this map compares with the one that Paul showed during the last presentation, but you can see that the COVID-19 has been much less administered per 100 people in the light green and white countries, and the majority of them are in sub-Saharan countries. 48 sub-Saharan governments are expected to need at least 12.5 billion to vaccinate 70% of their population. And according to the COVAX commitment, COVAX is the organization which is in charge of rolling out vaccines over the world. 41 sub-Saharan countries will have 20% of their population covered by end 2021, which bodes ill for achieving herd immunity soon in Africa. Next slide, please. When we consider financing, well, it's not easy to find information strictly related to road investment on a global scale. Probably the most relevant figures around are the ones in the report by McKinsey and the IRF in 2018. The world needs to invest more than $900 billion in its roads annually. But this is a global figure. It's not broken down according to the different countries. And the same report said that in the road sector, current investments fall short of this figure by 20%, that is $180 billion yearly, each year. Another figure we can find to try and evaluate what should be spent on roads is the American Jobs Plan recently presented by President Biden, and it includes $150 billion to be spent on roads and bridges with a focus on resilience over the next 8 years. But in general, we do not have specific figures for roads, and we have large figures also, but for infrastructure at large, which comprises not only roads, but more generally transport infrastructure and possibly also water and energy. So if it's not quite easy to get an evaluation, I put here some percentage of GDP that would be needed to achieve sustainable development goals and a limit of warming to 2 degrees Celsius. But this is clearly not very accurate, I think, and we have some conflicting evaluations between organizations. But the fact is huge. The needs are huge. They're compounded by climate change, and it's a difficult situation for low-income countries. Next, please. Of course, we've heard before that industrialized countries are making financial commitments with huge money on the table towards recovery. They're still in the legislative making. You heard that not all countries in the EU have presented their plans, and the same way in the USA. But according to the International Monetary Fund, sub-Saharan countries have a worse situation. They're caught in the policymakers' trilemma. At the top of the figure, they need to spend more money, and this is not new. The demand for government spending for development is not new. It was already that way before the pandemic, but it is, of course, compounded by the pandemic. But how can we spend more money? Can we borrow? There are rising concerns about debt, so that international financing institutions came up with a debt service suspension initiative. But believe it or not, it's not a panacea. Some countries do not want to apply for this initiative because they are afraid that they would lose by rating agencies. They might lose their standard and face more difficult times ahead when they want to borrow. So such countries as Benin, for instance, have a finance minister that has taken a step against applying for DSSI. So again, not a panacea. And resistance to tax increases, that's not specific to sub-Saharan countries, but it's even more difficult in sub-Saharan countries because of what the World Bank calls the long shadow of informality. A large part of the economy is informal, so that it's difficult to raise taxes. Next slide, please. Procurement has been touched in much detail by previous speakers, so I will not elaborate too much on that. There are mainly two main points. When we look at these countries, a large part of their financing is brought by multilateral or bilateral donors. And these donors are scrutinizing the procurement process. There has been a kind of progress recently because most multilateral development banks have allowed more freedom in procurement schemes by adopting the FIDIC 2017 suite of contracts, which gives more freedom to countries in their procurement schemes instead of the traditional design, bid, build process. They're allowed to use some other ones. But the key issue is not the color of the FIDIC book here. You use a red FIDIC book for traditional contracts, a yellow FIDIC book for design and build, but it's not about the color of the books. It's about capacity building. It's about being able to manage those type of contracts. And I cannot agree more with Dejan, who mentioned earlier that the first step for good project preparation is to know what the road authority wants to do. Does it want to make in-house or does it want to outsource, and does it have the capacity to monitor what is done outside? So the essential focus, therefore, is on project preparation. Project preparation, and especially the financial aspect of project preparation, is usually not a big problem in OECD countries or in China. But in Africa, it's a bit more difficult. There are numerous project preparation facilities. To a large extent, each multilateral development banks or each international financing institution has its own project preparation facility. But a report by an organization named ICA, Infrastructure Consortium for Africa, a study that dates back to 2012, made recommendations for better implementation and better coordination. And it looks like there is still some way to go for better coordination of these project preparation facilities, which are really working in silos in most instances. There is good news, however, with the project preparation software that is named Source, that has been promoted by multilateral development banks and was again promoted during the recent summit on financing African economies here in Paris last month. It's already used in some developing countries, and I think the good point is it's not an additional software placed on the local administration, but it's rather a software that is tailored to existing procedures in the country to make it more acceptable and usable by local road authorities. So this is a topic that we are going to look into in our task force on good project preparation. Next slide, please. The issue of transparency and due diligence is a continuous issue. It was mentioned already by previous speakers, and I want to pay tribute here to the work done by PIARC on this issue. PIARC had 3 technical committees in a row that produced some recommendations on fight against corruption, including a no-nonsense toolkit, anti-corruption toolkit that you may want to look into. I have focused here more specifically on the money that is received by countries from the International Monetary Fund. But of course, the IMF is very concerned about the good governance of countries that receive IMF financing during the crisis. So the IMF has come up with governance measures and safeguards, assessments. Implementation of these practices have proved challenging in some cases. The good news, however, is that some countries have found that adopting these proposed measures on a permanent basis would be a good idea, not only during the pandemic period, but also in the future. And so I think this may be a good news for future improvement of transparency issues. Next slide, please. So a couple of conclusions. From a health perspective, achieving herd immunity is of paramount interest to everyone. And then we need to focus on low-income countries. Solving the policymakers' dilemma will require substantial support for more affluent countries. And global organization will have an essential role to play on the road to recovery. I'm not mentioning only among global organizations, multilateral development banks, but the World Health Organizations and COVAX have also an essential role to play in fighting the pandemic at global level. This is clearly a prerequisite. But then it will also be necessary to provide adequate financing and mobilize resources from across the board, from all public and private actors concerned. And here I have not in mind specifically the buzzword about public-private financing and public-private partnerships, which in my view can only solve a small part of the problems. But the private sector needs also to mobilize resources and mainly human resources. This was mentioned earlier. Many people in the industry, either in the consulting or contracting industry, face shortages in human resources. And this is, together with education, also an important step to consider for an improvement of the road to recovery. Next slide. I think I'm done, and I'm obviously prepared to answer your questions, if any. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Michel, for this presentation. And thank you to all the speakers for all the very good presentations, and to the participants that have stayed with us and have already made some questions. I think we're running 10 minutes late, but I think maybe we can all stay 10 extra minutes. We might be able to cover all the questions and maybe a few more that will arrive now. So I will provide the floor to Veronica Arias, PIARC Technical Advisor, to moderate these questions and answers. Please, Veronica, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Miguel. And once again, thank you all our speakers for sharing all this knowledge with us and with the participants. And also thank you to the participants for making those interesting questions and giving some opinions in the chat. So we will try to keep the answer in around 1 minute to be able to answer the most number of questions. The first question is intended to Dejan, and it's made by Brendan Hallman, and it says, many of us are old enough to remember the previous stimulus package after the financial crisis in 2008. How is this different, and what we have learned? So Dejan, could you help us to give an answer, please?
Yes, thanks to Brendan for an answer. I think the lessons from that crisis are already included in the latest framework by the IMF. So it's difficult for me to answer what's different now between the now and the responses in the past crisis. But as we could see through many presentations, I still believe that there's a saying called "careful fools rush in," that when we are thinking about acceleration of any project preparation processes, it should be a result of a systematic optimization effort rather than ad hoc measures. Thank you.
Thank you, Dejan. Okay, we will move to the next question, which is intended to Simon, and it's made by Karnam Govardhan, and it says, can we expect fully loaded roads as pre-COVID times in the future? It will be definitely then some percentage, isn't it?
Yeah,
Simon?
Thank you for the question. I will try to be brief. On a global point of view, in 10 years, you will have more cars on the roads than in 2020. On a global point of view, the sale will increase slower than before, around 2% per year. In Europe, you will have less of private car ownership. I don't know if that there will be less cars, but I mean, at least less car ownerships, and you will have a better combined and shared mobility. So new alternative modes will be more combined with private cars. So we are going for the private car model for all trips to something more fragmented and more shared in Europe. At least it is the objective, but I'm not sure that we will have less cars on the roads in 10 years. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, let's move to the next question, which is made to Valérie, and it's made by Carmen Govardhan again. The question is, from the history, it's known to all that every time humanity hit hard by something, it bounced back stronger than ever. This applies to COVID too. But only thing I didn't understood is, do we need to reduce our investments toward road projects because ideal transportation condition is most of the people should stay in their homes until it's required? How we should take this?
Yeah, thank you for the question. But actually, all the travel patterns are still unpredictable at this stage. As Simon says, we still anticipate that the network will be busy. The project targeted by the investment mainly concern the maintenance of infrastructure, so without adding capacity. However, when there are capacity reflector in terms of public transport in correlation with the sustainable development policy adopted by the ministry. So actually, we are moving this for the major project in the province.
Thank you, Valérie. Our next question is made to Fabio Pasquali, and the question comes from Jose Manuel Blanco. The question is, I agree that the positive economic effects of public investment in infrastructure might be counterbalanced by the negative effects on higher taxes, but why allocate the tax increase to infrastructure and do not to other uses as public investment? Or, to put it in another way, is it not the case that even though that the citizens consider transport infrastructure in general and road infrastructure in particular to be a higher priority, when it comes down to it, those in power tend not to give in the priority?
Thank you. Thanks to Jose Manuel. Well, I think that it's not entirely true that governments tend not to allocate finance to roads. It is true that based on priorities, in turn based on ecological transition, different modes of investment are preferred. But at the same time, investment in roads still remains one of the major items in the finance. I think that you had to make a difference between investment and current expenditure. Current expenditure, in many cases, is getting shorter and shorter, and it just causing in the past problems with respect to maintenance. It is true that it's extraordinary maintenance and not ordinary maintenance, but to save on ordinary maintenance, the backlog will be higher, and you will feel bad sooner than in an optimal plan, let's say. I think that there is the contradiction that you can't solve. You use a road, you don't pay for that road. Many countries, I think of France, Germany, have tried to overpass the situation with some schemes based on pay per pollute and its air market tolling. And also the European Union has given an interesting background, which is the directive, which is changed every 3 or 4 years, the Eurovignette one. But we are still back with respect to that. I mean, the road industry needs resources, and one of the possible solutions is a set of methods of tolling. And if you pass through many countries worldwide, including developing countries, you find some interesting schemes from this point of view, because the state of the road network is worrying everywhere. And all road administrations, all governments are back up 8 to 10 years or even 20 in some cases with respect to the maintenance, extraordinary maintenance program.
Thank you, Fabio, for your answer. We will move to the next question, which is made to Paul from Hicham Rahali from Canada. The question is, from risk management perspective, how the new collaborative model can improve the risk management in projects, and what are the risks that may emerge from the new model associated with?
Yes, thanks, Veronica. And that's a very good question, Hisham. Yes, there's a lot of reflection about how risk is measured and calculated in a collaborative contracts. And I think there's a more effort done when you're in a collaborative mode to make sure that you're, first and foremost, you got your KPIs in place, you have your value for money understood with the client. And then once that is clearly articulated, the contractor, consultant, and the owners at their behest, they have to come back and understand and create a risk matrix which is to be documented in a way or measured, and such that these measurements would support to balance the risk between the three parties, between the developer, client, and the contractor. It's easier said than done. We can always say that this was the same principles for the traditional modes of contracts, but what we have to do is to step back and make sure that once the risk is being documented and distributed, then it's very easy where you can at best balance them as well. To the second part of the question, what are the risks with the new model? Now, this collaborative contracting is specifically, you can say, trust is one of the most important elements. And with the risk of the new model is that the moment there is an issue between where within the collaboration model there is an issue between a contractor or, for example, the developer turning sides and becoming not that we can call it keeping no dispute or no claims being one of your mantras within collaborative contracting. While if you start turning the heads on those lines, you've already broken some of the trusts which have been created while developing the collaborative model itself. So you may say it's a pitfall if you think about it, and hence there's always a necessity that the behaviors are nurtured between the three parties, and more so it's where you need to have an integrator in place. Otherwise, you would always expect some of them falling in line while some of them don't want to listen, if you call it. So those behavioral changes and which is part of the human nature could be posing a threat or a risk, if you like, once you're into a collaboration model. I hope that answers the question.
It sure did. Thank you, Paul. Okay, so we will move to the next question that is made to Michel, and it comes from Jose Manuel Blanco. It says, do you think that the low percentage of vaccinated people in these countries might cause difficulties in terms of attracting companies and specialists to work there?
¿Qué tal, Jose Manuel? Yes. Well, I think it's the answer is a bit mitigated. From the benchmark that was made by S.p.A, what we have seen is that work has continued, and in sub-Saharan African countries, there has not been a huge problem or slowdown in activity. But of course, strict measures had to be applied, but this does not seem to have slowed down work too much. I would not say the same thing for project preparation. I have examples in mind where it's sometimes difficult to bring both the staff of donors, for instance, a multilateral development bank. They do not travel too much to those countries nowadays, and also experts who sometimes are called to participate in local assessments, but they find it also difficult to travel. And so I think this will have an impact on project preparation. It will slow project preparation down a little bit. But for the time being, I think the works have been sustained, but I expect more delays with future projects.
Thank you, Michel. Let's go to the next question that it's made to Dejan, and it comes from Jose Manuel Blanco again. The question is, am I right in saying that we can expect huge resistance from the large construction and supply industry if approaches are developed that split major projects into numerous smaller ones?
It's a very good question, Jose Manuel Blanco. My first guess would be yes, because as you have from Paul Raphael's presentation, there's a bigger story that is going on in the background in the global market. So as I mentioned before, countries have reduced their in-house capacity to manage contracts. That caused them to use bigger contracts. And in the recent past, they've been very much relying on EPC contracts, transferring as much risk as possible to the private sector. After several private companies got, let's say, burnt, the big contractors have lost the appetite to take on these big contracts because they carry a lot of uncertainty. And they can also take on a lot of, let's say, low probability, high impact events, which can cause them to take a big hit in a major project. And what the industry is pushing now for is to, let's say, keep the big projects, but to move to a, let's say, more generous risk allocation, which in fact is the collaborative approach. But as I said before, there is some fine tuning necessary in terms of how we procure. And I believe it's a fundamental error to replace one size fits all approach with another one size fits all approach. These approaches, including collaborative methods, need to be used in a targeted fashion and not just to have a €1 billion project and throw out the EPC model and replace it with the collaborative approach. It does not mean that these major projects will be split into 20 smaller contracts, but they may be split into a few smaller contracts. And the experience we have so far is that, for example, a major alliancing project in Australia got split in four separate contracts. And that also, by definition, made it more accessible to smaller contractors, which makes it better for the taxpayer. Thank you.
Thank you, Dejan. Okay, let's move to the next question that is intended to Simon, and it comes from Jax Almoles. The question is there any numbers about the lack of maintenance caused by year of late?
Yeah, I took the time to wrap up some figures I had in stocks already in 25. The World Bank referred some scientific data on cost of delaying maintenance of the road. On the figures, if you neglect your infrastructure for 3 years, you have to expect on average 6 times costs of maintenance. If you do it for 6 years, it's you multiply it by 18 times for cost maintenance. As well, from a more European perspective, the Spanish Road Associations issued some elements 5-6 years ago for the Spanish case between 2001 and 2013, the cost of maintenance per kilometer on major road assets and on secondary network went up by 2. So we have a very large library and figures on this. So yeah, definitely for, in our point of view, maintenance matters.
Thank you, Simon. Okay, let's move to the next question. Yeah, I think we still have time for a couple of more. The question is made to Valérie, and Jacques Almales is the one who makes the question, which is which is the budget for the A30 project?
Yeah, thank you. It's going to be a quite short answer. So unfortunately, this information is confidential, but I can assure that the project estimation is higher than $100 million, because for Quebec, the difference between all the project is the line is $100 million. So now it's a major project, so it's higher than that.
Thank you, Valérie. The next question comes from Adewal Tajudin from Spain, and it's made to Michel, which the question say, the general conception is people do not always obey the traffic rules or abide with the rules. But in the case of low, medium income countries, people do not understand the rules. How can educational capacity building of these developing nations may be mitigated in order to have sustainable and safe road intervention?
مصطفى خلصت ورجعت رحت على الزبير رجعت جيت.
Michel?
Yes, yeah. Thank you for your question. I will not be able to answer it from a, I would say, legal or regulatory perspective. But I will take a contractor's perspective. We have recently witnessed a stronger emphasis put by multilateral development banks in their contracts, a stronger emphasis on a variety of issues that were previously, I would not say overlooked, but clearly less emphasized, notably on what we call social, environmental, health, and safety issues. For a simple reason, as far as safety is concerned, there have been some problems on some work performed by companies, and this has led many organizations, many development banks to toughen their rules. In this instance, I think contractors, when they perform work, have to put also a strong emphasis on preventing accidents and paying a very, very strict attention to traffic and pedestrian traffic, two-wheelers and so on around their job sites. That is extremely important, and it's taking more and more importance from a contractor's perspective. But I cannot answer on the general legal or regulatory framework. You're right also that there are some traffic rules that we would like as contractors to see more followed, and these are about the overloading of trucks, because this causes huge damages to roads. So these are two topics that we are concerned with as contractors, but for the rest, I cannot speak for the general legal perspective. I'm sure there are some global organizations which take care of this.
Thank you, Michel. Okay, and we will move to the last question that is made to Dejan from Miguel Caso. The question is, as you mentioned, most of the investments on transport infrastructure are today concentrated in the cities, where more people can benefit from them, most of them highly subsidized. On the other hand, in rural areas, most of the transport infrastructure is financed by users, while income per capita is generally lower than in the cities. How would you introduce equity aspects between rural and urban infrastructure projects in your economic assessment?
Thank you. It appears to be a day for tough questions. First Brendan and now Miguel. Luckily, I know a better answer to this question than I did to the first one. What we've learned from applications of transport policy in some countries while I was at the ITF is that not everything should be put into the investment appraisal or try to solve all equity problems through the tolling. So it was deemed that it is better, for example, if you can have tolls, that you apply a dynamic tolling system that is the same for everybody, but then that the state use the social transfer system to compensate those which are worse off. So we shouldn't, even though we are talking about the road sector, we shouldn't forget the state has a comprehensive system to try to balance out inequities. Inequalities between different social groups, and it's better to use those mechanisms in a concerted fashion rather than trying to solve everything through one of them, just because it happens to be closer in our mindset. Thank you.
Thank you, Dejan. And once again, thank you to all our participants who made these very interesting questions, and also thank you to the speakers for sharing their knowledge with us. So I give the floor to Miguel.
Thank you.
Thank you to all the speakers and all the participants who made all those interesting questions. It was a very interesting Q&A, and thank you, Veronica, for moderating it, and June for supporting as well the coordination. So I will just conclude the webinar today and talk a little bit about the next steps. So Pierre will still do some webinars about COVID-19. You will have the next one at the end of the month. Please check our webpage. You will have the recordings of today and the set of presentations available in our webpage from the next week. Well, with all this, I just want to thank you again and thank the speakers for the great presentations, and thank you all for staying until the end. I hope you enjoyed the webinar. I hope it was fruitful for you, and I wish you a nice evening, afternoon, or morning, depending where you are, and please take care. See you soon.